The leverage of dominance in a relationship in today's eyes and society is automatically viewed as abuse. It's automatically viewed as being manipulative, right? That's just the truth of the matter. And I think many people don't accept that. They don't accept that. Either they don't see it or they don't accept it. Now, what this means is this. What typically keeps those scenarios from being viewed as abuse or manipulation is respect, desire, and consent, right? Respect, desire, and consent. Because respect between a teacher and a student doesn't look the same. What good teacher doesn't test, right? Now, this is where we have to understand the concept of premature integration, right? What is premature integration? Premature integration is when two people become attached to one another without properly being in their respective roles of the sexual polarity quadrant, which is either one or both people are not in an abundance mindset. Now, what does that mean? That means that if you are in a position, in a relationship, right, where in said relationship, you desire control, you desire power, right? You have a plan about how you want that relationship to run. You have an ideology about how relationships work in general. And this is how you do things. This is your program, right? Now, if you have a program and you are upfront about your program, then an individual can either get with it or they can get left, right? That's true. What premature integration does is it slows down that process of being willing to leave if the respect, the desire, or the consent isn't present. Now, one thing to understand about premature integration and how it typically works is this. When you are prematurely integrated, then oftentimes there may be an individual who is either feminine dominant or masculine submissive. And typically, those two things correlate with one another and they are compatible with one another, right? Now, if an individual flip-flops, right? They flip-flop on what role they want to play within the sexual polarity quadrant, depending on how they feel in the moment and what day it is, then one thing that can happen is that there will often be two different mindsets that they deal with an individual from, right? They may have pockets of feminine submissive. They may have pockets of feminine dominant. They may have pockets of masculine submissive, and maybe even pockets of masculine dominance. And what do I mean by that? Pockets of masculine dominance is having the capacity to desire to reward good behavior from a position of control, right? You're in a position of control. You're using teasing, edging, pleasure denial, sexually and non-sexually, using delayed gratification to get a person in a position where you will give them a higher level of pleasure and a higher level of reciprocation in their experience of what that is due to your program. But while you're doing that, you're getting the things that you want out of it, right? That's rewarding good behavior. That's masculine dominance, right? What's feminine dominance? That's the inconsistency. That's the manipulation, right? That is the love bombing. That's the lying about what you want and what you want the relationship to look like simply because you want the person to stick around. That's also an aspect of feminine dominance, right? Now, something to understand is that when you are in a relationship with a dominant individual, that if you are prematurely integrated, that individual is going to take your moments of when your actions, behaviors, and your energy is receptive to them. And in order for them to continue to deal with you, they have to view your submissive moments and the submissive space, the subspace, that submissive identity as the real you, right? Now, if that's not the real you, or if you're highly conflicted within yourself, then out of fear of no longer being with them, you may feminine dominantly agree by taking a masculine submissive stance while also trying to convince the person that you are receptive to the type of dynamic that they desire to have. And this can work for both men and women. This isn't a one-sided thing, right? Like, what's an example of a man doing this with a woman? Let's say a man is taking a masculine submissive stance with a woman. right? He's investing in her emotionally, socially, and financially in exchange for having access to her sexually and having access to her time, right? Because he's attracted to her. Now, let's say this particular man finds himself in a scenario, right, where he doesn't have the money, right? He's running himself dry. And because he's running himself dry, he's going to have an inability to follow through with the promises that he makes about the investment that he's going to make, right? He's going to have an inability to follow through with the consistency of it because he's not in abundance, right? So this man may promise, oh, I'll have this and I'll have this and I'll do this and I'll do that, from a stance of the masculine submissive, but it's feminine dominant because he's going to be unable to be truly consistent with what he's providing, but his attachment makes him willing to promise things that he cannot follow through with. Now, how this can work on the other side is this, and this is some of my issue with the modern concepts and ideas of relationships and the idea that they should always be equal. It doesn't work like that. I think most relationships are not equal, and I don't think a relationship being equal is the indication that that relationship is healthy. But what can happen is this. Sometimes in premature integration, an individual can agree to things when they're in that highly aroused or highly respectful, highly feminine place of mind, right? Tap into pockets of the feminine submissive, right? And they may say things that they agree to in the moment. But once they become removed from that scenario, or once that situation is put under pressure, then they may find themselves in a scenario where they are unable to do the things that they agreed with doing. And then they switch to a perspective of viewing themselves in a relationship with the dominant individual as something that they don't desire. So they will desire a reciprocal amount of submissiveness, similarity, in order to not feel insecure about the relationship dynamic. See, something to understand is that when you're a dominant individual and you're dating, it's very important to understand that in these particular types of scenarios, how it will often work is that if an individual doesn't take a feminine submissive stance quickly, right? Or let's say you didn't develop higher levels of your dominant ego and how you interact in your program until later on into knowing an individual. Then at times they may be unsure about the dynamic, and there are different tests that will arise, but the person may not be true, or they may not be consistent with the role that they want to play. Now, what can happen in this dynamic is this. In order to leverage or to set up the scenario in a way that benefits the overall growth of the relationship dynamic, because if the dominant person is attached to an individual who already isn't in the feminine submissive, then there may be moments of the feminine dominant from the dominant individual in order to manipulate the situation to where the person can be more comfortably in the more comfortably in the submissive position. Now, what can this look like? This can look like gaslighting, right? Let's say you're dealing with an individual. You're a dominant person, right? Sometimes they're down for what you're trying to do. Sometimes they're not as down for what you're trying to do. Now, if you are communicating with them in a way where you are expressing the ways that they have felt, the ways that they have interacted with you in a way that was beneficial towards your program, but that's not the mind state that they're in at this point in time. If they have a negative view of that submissive state of being because their cup is low, then they will view you communicating and convincing them of how they've behaved before, what they've done before, what's consistent, what's inconsistent, how they're viewing things wrong based off of the program that you set for the situation. Even if you've communicated and they've agreed to it, they will view that as gaslighting because you're invalidating their point of view. See, ultimately, the recipe for the feminine submissive is desire and respect, right? And it is the desire, respect, and consent that keeps a dominant, submissive relationship from being abusive, from being manipulative, because the person has to consent to being manipulated. The person has to consent to pretty much being molded in some of their preferences, some of their ways of interacting, and to bend that, to be malleable to the program of the dominant individual, especially of the masculine dominant individual. So oftentimes the idea of invalidating someone's emotions isn't the point of invalidating everything that they've ever felt, saying that everything they ever thought, everything they ever felt was wrong. Sometimes the view of gaslighting can be as simple as an individual who had one point of view at one point in time, or at least expressed that, whether honestly or dishonestly, and then taking that perspective that they had, bringing it back up to them, and then expressing how this is a better way of viewing things. This is a better way of doing things. And if they feel contrary to that in that moment, then they may view it as manipulation and abuse, emotional abuse. Right? Now, one thing about being a masculine dominant is that the masculine dominant rewards good behavior. If what it is that you're providing is emotional validation, social validation, and financial investment on the back end of someone who is on your program, then that's, if you're like a masculine dominant man, then offering sexuality up front may be more your steez. Now, you reward good behavior by investing more time, energy, resources, affection, based off of how well this individual is picking up the program. Now, where premature integration becomes an issue is because as a person grows accustomed and grows attached to the, especially when it comes to a woman, the emotional validation, social validation, financial investment that you are investing, if that becomes a higher priority, then their natural desire to be submissive, their respect for you, your state of mind, your program, your insight, your guidance, and their sexual desire for you, right? Their desire to give up control, their desire to receive pleasure. Then they may have times where social programming will seep back in and they will desire to be more equal in the relationship dynamic. You got to understand this aspect of it, right? Now, like I said before, anything that you trade for sex can be used against you as a man. You have to understand that, right? And if you understand that, then whatever it is that you take away, because things are not going your way in a dynamic where you've been consistently providing whatever that is going to feel as if you are abusing them. It's going to feel as if you are taking advantage. It's going to feel as if you are manipulating them. What does that mean? That means that there's a difference between rewarding good behavior when you didn't previously provide these things, right? And taking away the things that validate an individual because they are not showing progress, or because they are not making progress suitable to what your standards are when it comes to your program. So what does that mean? What does that look like? And there could be reasons for this, right? See, when you're a masculine dominant, think about my video, the Mr. Miyagi principle, right? Or the Mr. Miyagi method, right? Part of what a teacher does is a teacher tests their student. That's what a teacher does. A teacher tests their student. That's how they see where the progress is. That's how they identify the progress. That's how they identify the strengths and the weaknesses. That's how they identify what needs to be worked on and improved on in order to better the dynamic. See, as a masculine dominant, you have a program. You have a way of viewing dating and relationships that for you is the proper way of doing things, in a way that you can be honest about when it comes to the things that you desire to be dominant about. And it doesn't have to be everything. But in that dynamic, that's how things work. That's how it goes. Right? That's how it works and that's how it goes. But what can happen along the way is this. When you have this program, if you aren't upfront about this program, then an individual may truly be interacting with you because of other things that you're providing and not have a natural inclination towards being submissive towards you. So they're really being submissive, not from an intrinsic place, but from a transactional place about the things that you're providing that would be offering submissiveness for yourself. Right? Understand what I'm saying here. So when we're looking at these different dynamics of relationships and we're looking at these different aspects of the sexual polarity quadrant, to be dominant and prematurely integrated means that in order to improve the scenario, to get it better in line, there may be moments where a person is testing you based off of masculine submissiveness to see if you will take an equal masculine submissive perspective to where they're coming from, to see if you will validate their ego, to validate their low self-esteem in moments where their behavior is technically bad according to your program, and it doesn't fall in line with the direction and the trajectory that you want to set for the relationship. Now, that's something that's important to understand, right? When you understand this aspect of the sexual polarity quadrant, then more things kind of come into frame. They come into the picture. They come into the picture because when you recognize that that's how things can be, then you know that when you meet someone, it's important to lead from a perspective of your program from the beginning, to not prematurely integrate, and to make sure that the way that you're doing things is one that does have a certain level of character involved, right? And not only character, but consistency. The person has to accept that they're in a position where they are pretty much earning the validation that they desire from you. And they have to recognize that earning it is something that will cause them to enjoy and to appreciate it more. And they also have to understand that you bending off of your square to validate their ego when they don't deserve it based off of your program would be them wanting you to carry yourself in a way that is less respectable. Because truthfully, when you have a stance that you've expressed, an individual trying to get you to move off of that stance in order to validate their ego is them seeking to emotionally manipulate you. But oftentimes, people won't see it that way when it comes to issues of emotional validation, right? Or when it comes to issues of long-term relationships, right? See, the thing to understand is that when you are dominant, someone has to consent to the control that they give you, right? But there also has to be a certain level of desire and respect there that keeps that consistent, that keeps them on that line enough to be in a position to earn it and to experience the pleasure of earning the validation that they desire to receive. And if they're no longer in that position, then they may have a flip of perspective to a completely different mindset that is contrary to the way that you want to run that relationship. And like I say, anything you trade for sex can be used against you, right? So if you're trading emotional validation for sex, then if you take away that emotional validation because a woman isn't having sex with you, then guess what? Now she can see you as emotionally manipulative or as just an emotionally abusive individual. She may just see you as a guy who is bait and switching or as a guy who is love bombing, right? That's one reason why you don't want to lead with things that you aren't going to naturally desire to be consistent with, and that you haven't already verified through the behavior of the individual that you're dealing with that they can be consistent with the actions that will cause you to desire to reciprocate the things that they desire for their ego to feel stroked. Important concept to understand. Because a lot of this stuff is about languages, right? True submission isn't just a woman desiring to have sex with you. That's not true submission. It is a level of the feminine submissive, right? But if she doesn't respect your mindset, your point of view, your ideology, then she may never receive your program. True submission is about an individual trading their social programming in for your program. Now, there may be instances where that individual will feel at odds with themselves between what people say, what society says, what social media says, what their church says, what their family says, what their friends say. And then they may fall back into that lane of desiring to be in a masculine, submissive, equal relationship. Now, one thing that you'll often notice about individuals who have this flip-flopping type of mentality is that oftentimes they will have opportunities to date someone who is submissive, but they are not attracted to that. They're not attracted to it. They're just at odds with themselves about their desire to be submissive themselves. Right? That's something to understand. And when you take that type of individual and you're pushing this point of view on them, even if they've agreed to it before, then now it feels as if you are gaslighting or emotionally manipulating them when you're expressing the same concepts, ideas, beliefs, standards, and values that you previously expressed and that they've previously agreed to. Right? Like a woman can come over. Let's say you ask a woman to Netflix and chill. You say, come over, let's Netflix and chill. Right? Now, you're offering a certain level of non-sexual access to yourself. Let's say that woman comes over 1-2 times. Let's say y'all have sex the first time. The novelty, the excitement is high. Let's say it works like that, right? Now, after these experiences, something that can transpire is, let's say, the third time she comes over. It's like, well, can we just hang out and watch Netflix and not really have sex this time? If you say no, then either she can get offended and leave. She may say that she feels pressured because the intrinsic desire wasn't high enough. It may have been a manipulation tactic to switch the confines and the context of the scenario to be one that's more favorable towards her egoistic desires. Or it may be a situation where that was simply a test, and by you standing your ground and standing on your square about what it is that you want to do, the respect grows. Understand what I'm saying? So a lot of being masculine dominant is about knowing what you want to do, making yourself attractive for that outcome, and not bending on that just because you want to maintain having access to a particular individual. Because when you bend on that to desire to maintain access to a particular individual, you are stepping in the lane of the feminine dominant if you still desire to be dominant and still desire control. Right? Because if somebody will break the rules to help you, they'll break the rules to hurt you. Right? So if you break the rules, your own rules, to make that woman feel happy or to make her feel validated, when your standards haven't been met, then eventually your own cup may run dry. Your own cup may run dry. Right? And when that particular thing occurs, then a monster may appear up out of you. If this is a person who isn't truly receptive to dominance, then when you say, okay, well, I'll put my dominance to the side for right now to make this individual feel comfortable, then eventually the true dominance is going to come out. And if they're not a person who is receptive to your dominance, your masculine dominance, to you taking a very direct stance on what you believe, what you stand for, what you're trying to do, what you want the dynamic to be, then when you finally put your foot down, it's going to greatly hurt the individual. And it may not come out in the most kind way. And I think it's important for us to understand this aspect of the sexual polarity quadrant. Right? But think about, and what I like to think about with that example is Lestat on this new interview with the Vampire Show. I've been doing some content on it. I think Lestat is a great example of this concept because Louis was a masculine submissive. Louis had pockets of the feminine submissive where he would give himself over to the desires of giving himself over to his vampire instincts, but ultimately he viewed those vampire instincts as evil, as wrong, and as contrary to having good standards, good moral values, and good principles. That didn't take away his desire to engage in those things at all. But it meant that he would, instead of finding a way to do what he wanted to do in his true desires in a way that didn't conflict too much with his morals and values, he would just pretty much starve himself until he lost complete control over his desires. And then he would attack probably the wrong person at times. That's what Louis would do. But Lestat, if you got deeper into the vampire Lestat, you'll notice that the narratives that were shared about the vampire Lestat were that in the interview with the vampire, it was someone who felt as if they were abused. They felt like they were in a very manipulative, abusive, narcissistic relationship dynamic, that they were codependent on this individual, and that although this is what they wanted, this wasn't really what they wanted. Understand what I'm saying? Now, in the vampire Lestat, this situation was broken down to where really Lestat would only try to give death to those deserving, right? Which means that he really had more moral values about who he would kill versus who he wouldn't kill, right, than Louis did. He also gave Louis the opportunity to consent, right, before he turned him into a vampire. He did these things. So something to understand is that's how it can work. And another thing to understand about the dominant role is that oftentimes the dominant role is being a teacher. When you're a masculine dominant, you have an ideology, you have an outlook on dating and relationships, that when you are seeking to integrate with an individual, you are sharing your program with them while engaging in the behaviors that they intrinsically enjoy that you want to do. And then during that time, you see if they're able to integrate and receive your program. You're a teacher. Now, a person has to respect you enough to see your way of doing things and your way of viewing things as correct, right? And to desire you more than a desire to do things a specific way, so that they can enjoy that process, to take the challenges and the tests as an opportunity to pass, as an opportunity to grow, as an opportunity to succeed, instead of seeing it as something that challenges their self-worth, their self-value, and who they are as a person. That's why I say the feminine submissive is an abundance mindset. And I think oftentimes this can be missed. It can be very easily missed, this point right here. So, like I said about the Mr. Miyagi method, a great example of masculine dominance is he would have Daniel-san wax on, wax off, paint the fence, sand the floor. And then while he would do this, and while he would interact with Daniel-san in this individual way, he was testing him. When he was testing his ability to be receptive, he was testing his ability to learn, but he was also developing smaller traits and muscle groups so that when it came time for him to actually learn the martial arts, his body would be prepared enough to be able to take the training that would come with the growth in that particular field, in that particular system of knowledge and fighting, right? If he were to just jump out the gate with Daniel-san with his weak frame and tried to teach him karate and martial arts as he was, he probably wouldn't have been able to receive that program. He had to go through the training. He had to go through the testing first. So when you understand this, there is a process to it. And that process does include things that can look a good bit like brainwashing. That process can look a good bit like invalidating someone's emotions and gaslighting, right? Because in this particular dynamic and in this particular scenario, there is a hierarchy about who has the particular set of skills and the particular set of knowledge that is to be shared with the other individual. Right? Sometimes you'll go to a Muay Thai gym, kickboxing gym, and you'll see the coach walking around, giving people hits with a wiffle bat on their legs, on their arms, to prepare them to protect themselves at all times, but also to build up their pain tolerance. That's a test. That's a challenge, right? That's making things more difficult so that the individual will be prepared for what's ahead of them, right? Another thing you may see in a boxing gym is someone may be doing sit-ups, And then the coach will be like, okay, give me one more. Okay, give me one more. Okay, give me 5 more sit-ups. Because the goal is to stretch. The goal is to push them into a position where they can improve. But if they don't see that scenario and what they're learning as improvement, then they will constantly rebel, gripe, complain. And oftentimes the boxing coach will just kick them out the gym. Right? But when an individual does not consent to being in that type of dynamic, then oftentimes they will take it as bullying, they'll take it as abuse, they'll take it as manipulation. They'll be put in a scenario where they have to work, where they have to learn, where they have to improve, where they can't remain stagnant, and where they have to make a choice about what it is they want to do and where it is they want to go. And oftentimes the person who's in the masculine submissive will settle on a stagnant state of mind, on a very stagnant state of mind, so that they can avoid having to put in too much work, so that they can avoid having to put in too much energy, because they're already in a low cup space. Now, one thing about the masculine submissive is oftentimes the coping mechanisms that are used for that lifestyle, for that place within the sexual polarity quadrant, are coping mechanisms that work negatively towards the goals that they desire to reach. Now, by pretty much brainwashing, like people would see it, by creating an attachment or an addiction to certain practices, behaviors, and by establishing new coping mechanisms that are more so correlated to the dominant individual's program, the path towards growth can be much easier. But you have to be receptive in your mindset and your views and how you do things in order for that to be effective at all. If you have stifled submissiveness, then you are using that masculine submissiveness to force yourself into a position where, although you may have a capacity to experience the feminine submissive on a regular period of time, you have to convince yourself something is wrong with it so that you can't be consistent with it. It's being torn between. And when you're in that particular scenario, in that particular position, it oftentimes will come with negative ramifications. Those ramifications can simply be complaining, griping, complaining, and making excuses and quitting anytime you feel stretched or pushed, right? That's one. That's a big one. You know, another one is seeking to look at what makes a relationship equal in social programming in order to justify and validate your lack of growth, right? That's like a woman who says, oh, well, I just can't have an orgasm or penetration. You know, science says yada, yada, yada. Not understanding that the exact same mindset that she has is what's not only holding her back, but what's holding back other women. For example, maybe as simple as being very stubborn, wanting to maintain masculine frame when you don't have a dominant position, right? Which stifles submissiveness. And in that position, that's where an individual may get may be very stubborn and hold on to their stance, their social programming, in moments where, according to the context of the dynamic they've agreed to, they're wrong. But you'll want to put your foot down in scenarios where you're wrong and don't have the high ground, which will encourage more of the disrespect that you already feel you're getting, right? Making an agreement or having an understanding of being submissive, especially the feminine submissive, is basically consenting to and agreeing to being influenced, right? And any influence that is intentional or outside of what you decided that you wanted before you meet the individual in this day and age is viewed as manipulation. So, oftentimes it's best to lean into certain things instead of trying to fight it, because trying to lean into certain things of what people consider to be politically correct, you are putting yourself on the hook. You're putting yourself on the line of if any of the tactics that you use to gain or to maintain the leverage, which teasing, edging, pleasure denial, delayed gratification, like those things can be, those things start to become viewed as being manipulative or being abusive. So truthfully, when you accept and embrace being dominant as one of your character traits, as how you like to interact within a relationship, you vet for certain levels of malleability. You vet for certain levels of teachability. You hold yourself accountable to the principles and the character of how you carry yourself, because something to understand is this. When you are a teacher, when you are a leader, you are in some capacity molding certain views that the person that you're dealing with has. You are molding certain behaviors. You are rewarding and punishing certain behaviors that do not go in line with your program, because your program comes first, not the other person. And the reason why your program must come first is because, like I said earlier, if you'll break the rules to help someone, eventually, when you get frustrated, you will break the rules to hurt them. Right? If you break the rules to help them, you'll break the rules to hurt them. And you have to be self-aware about these things. But it's about being honest in what it is that you desire, so that the person can consent to the type of influence and the type of manipulation that does take place with dealing with a dominant individual. And I feel like people need to be more honest about this and not try to play so much on the line. Because when you hold yourself accountable not to your own program and don't develop your program in that capacity, right, to make sure that your character is maintained and that you're doing things in a certain way, then what can happen in these scenarios is that the person that you're dealing with may never come to a place where they accept that that's what's going on in your dynamic. And the thing about premature integration is that when you bring it up too late, the person may have already decided in their own mind that they're pretty much cooperating with you because of things that they're receiving from you. Right? And when they're cooperating with you because of other things that they're receiving from you, then it puts them in a situation where, for you to express how you truly feel and what type of dynamic that you really want to have, in their mind, it will feel as if you are asking for more, but offering less. And this is why having a certain level of intrinsic desire is so important when it comes to being a dominant man. This is why intrinsic desire in the side of the feminine submissive is so important, because without the intrinsic desire, the receptiveness to dominance, the attraction to masculinity, the attraction to dominance, then even if they agree on the surface to what it is that you want to do, at times it may be a bait and switch. At times it may be a love bomb. At times it may be an individual who's afraid of losing you because of the feeling that you provide them, but they don't intrinsically desire to be dominated enough for you to stretch them mentally, emotionally, or sexually in the ways that will cause them to be able to grow towards being able to integrate with your program. And the only way to get it there, if you're doing it after the fact when it comes to premature integration, is that it's too late, right? At that point, when you're already prematurely integrated, it's too late to be direct. Right? It's too late to just say, okay, well, it is what it is. No. There's manipulation that takes place. There's communication that takes place. There's a process of transition that takes place. And in these particular dynamics, in these particular scenarios, you're going to have to show, if you're prematurely integrated, then you're going to have to show your masculinity through your emotional discipline. And it may be through things that hurt for you to hear. See, part of the reason why the masculine dominant gets to test the feminine submissive, or gets to test the individual who's applying for that role of being feminine submissive with them, is because everybody tests everybody in some capacity, right? If you lack the self-awareness and situational awareness to be able to tell when you're testing an individual, you are not qualified to be a leader. You're not. Because you lack self-awareness and you lack situational awareness. You lack the ability to look at the entire situation on a grand scale, to think about the relationship dynamic holistically, and then to, from that point, be able to check yourself, right? And understand when you're saying things that may hurt your partner. Understand when you're saying things that may be contrary to the program, and to check yourself and decide, I'm not going to do that. So those tests can work in a variety of ways, right? Token resistance is a test, right? Now, the feminine dominant may deal with the token resistance by bypassing the boundaries, right? The masculine dominant may deal with token resistance by walking away. And one thing that I will say about this is sometimes people talk about things like gaslighting and also stonewalling, right? Stonewalling is also a big point of topic when people talk about, there's this big narcissistic witch hunt going on because people have only really been exposed to bad leadership. A lot of people, especially women, they have a lot of trauma in regards to relationships, especially from the men that they've chosen. So they have a trauma response to the idea of dominance, although their body and their just who they are as a person is attracted to that dominance, right? So let's say we're talking about the topic of stonewalling. That's seen as a manipulative tactic, right? To shut down and to shut your partner out. But when you're a masculine dominant, when you're a teacher, when you've already expressed yourself, when you've already said where it is that you stand on a particular issue, and then an individual is trying to communicate with you as if they are trying to siphon energy and get you to prove to them or bend to them first, or they're trying to force you to see their point of view so that they feel validated, so that they feel heard, when they aren't even carrying themselves in a way that is conducive to them being rewarded for good behavior. They're challenging you to reward their bad behavior, right? And when they're challenging you to reward their bad behavior as a dominant, you have to understand, this is something you have to understand as a dominant, right? That there may be times where a woman is using token resistance because she wants to play the cat and mouse game. And then there are other times where the woman may do the same exact thing from an energy space of not being receptive to you at all, right? So when it comes to your dominance, you don't change completely how you communicate in order to step into the mind frame of where the person is in that moment all the time. That's more of a reward for good behavior. You say, okay, cool, you're being receptive, you're listening, you're understanding, you're growing, you're learning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break these things down for you so you can learn. See, that's guidance that isn't unsolicited, right? When the masculine submissive steps into a frame of mind where they want you to see their point of view before they're willing to submit themselves in that moment, then what they're really doing is they're testing you. They're trying to manipulate you with the fear of losing them. So sometimes what stonewalling is simply saying, I've already said what the fuck I said. Now, either you can figure this shit out on your own, and when your attitude is better, when you're in a better space of energy, when you can remember the things that I've already told you, and you can give the proper response to this particular area, to this particular situation, this particular circumstance, then we can then resume this conversation and we can communicate with one another and we can do what we're doing. But you have to understand that as a dominant, when you understand and you express and you communicate that that's the role that you desire to play within the scenario, then by them wanting to make that a masculine submissive on masculine submissive dynamic of an equal partnership and relationship where they're stifling their submissiveness, they're taking away part of what they're offering to you by trying to communicate with you in this way. Why would you reward that with more of your time and energy and effort? In that situation, either you become a masculine submissive, and by denigrating and lessening your dominance to make them comfortable, you put yourself in a position where you're breaking the rules to make them comfortable, to help them. Eventually, that masculine submissiveness for a dominant individual will lead to a place where they feel frustrated. And when things aren't going their way long enough, eventually they're going to explode on that individual and say and or do some very hurtful things that they aren't anticipating, right? Or you're taking the feminine dominant role, agreeing to interact with them on their terms with no intention of it, seeking to lie and to manipulate them into doing what you want them to do. And many women say that they don't like that, but many women put themselves in that scenario, right? It's like, let's say a woman says, oh, I just like sex to just happen naturally, right? Desiring and requesting plausible deniability. It's like, let's say a guy comes over, they're supposed to fuck. She wants him to sit there and pretend that he wants to talk to her about her day and watch this movie and do all this other shit, when really he's there to fuck. And a woman may say, well, if he just tries to fuck anyways, and then I feel pressure. It's like, no, you don't desire to do it enough if you feel pressure. So really, him making his intentions known and getting the fuck out of there, if that's not what you want to do, is him respecting your boundaries. See, a lot of people push this idea of healthy communication as respecting someone's boundaries, when really you're disrespecting your own standards, your own values, your own boundaries to make an individual comfortable. And then by continuing to pursue them afterwards, you are putting what you want to the side to make them happy with no guarantee that they will reciprocate the favor. This is why intrinsic desire is so important. This is why the conversation of inadvertent behavior is so important. And I'll say this as well. There is a fine line between inadvertent behavior and aftercare. There are a lot of men who are into BDSM from a perspective of really just wanting to have a very equal relationship at its core, right? Not truly seeking to be dominant with their program or how they carry themselves, but just wanting to be dominant in the bedroom because they just got a kink for being rough sometimes. And there's a lot of women who are seeking the same thing, who truly aren't feminine submissive women, right? They truly aren't women who are in that truly submissive capacity. They're more so women who, there are women who are into BDSM only for the sake of feeling like they're getting guaranteed aftercare after having rough sex. That's a true thing. These are things that really take place. So I think it's important for us to understand these different relationship dynamics. And I'm going to just put it out there clear and clear cut without mincing my words. Choosing to be submissive is consenting to being manipulated. Not all manipulation is bad. You have to be able to agree with what that path of growth is and what it should look like. But you also have to understand that if you flip-flop between your stances, in order for a dominant person to continue to deal with you, they have to choose the stance that you take that best suits their program and view that as the real you. And this is where premature integration comes in. If they choose that aspect of you and that way that you convey yourself as the real you, right? And that's not the real you, then you're going to feel like they're constantly manipulating and trying to change you into something that you're not. And it's your fault. Call it victim blaming if you want. I don't give a fuck. I think people need to accept and understand these things and understand that most relationships aren't going to be equal, right? Whoever is the most emotional, whoever is the most inconsistent, who's ever the most flighty, who's ever the most flaky, whoever wants the other person the least is the one who's in control of the relationship in a masculine, submissive, and a quote-unquote equal relationship. Whoever has the least capacity to meet the other person's needs is the one who's in control. Because although the relationship is supposed to be equal, let's say you're a man, you're in a masculine, submissive relationship, there's love there, right? Masculine, submissive, and masculine, submissive. That woman may be in a position where her cup is low. So right now she can't meet your sexual needs, but she expects you to maintain the same level of emotional validation, social validation, and financial investment that you were previously making. Although this is siphoning out of your cup. Although your sexual needs are met, although your respect needs are met, now you are in a position where you are giving of yourself beyond what is an intrinsic desire to give of yourself in order to make this individual comfortable. See, a lot of healthy relationship ideas when it comes to relationship dynamics are really about putting women in a dominant position without even understanding that that's what it is. Because the desires and the needs of men and women, overall, what they want out of a relationship is mostly the same, but the order that they want it in is different. So a lot of women will view healthy communication as, okay, well, don't do anything and don't test me and don't do any of this stuff right here, and I'll do what I can and, we'll compromise. And she doesn't want to compromise on her emotional needs. right? She don't want to compromise on her emotional needs. She doesn't want to compromise on her social desires. She doesn't want to compromise on what it is she wants financially. Maybe she already feels as if she's compromising, and that's why she wants more of what she wants emotionally or socially, right? But at the end of the day, what are your needs as a man? Are those fully met? Now, one thing to understand when it comes to transactional and cooperative relationship dynamics is that relationships are almost never going to be 50-50. Sometimes it's going to be 60-40, sometimes 70-30, sometimes 80-20. Right? And my personal stance is this. If you have the ability to show emotional discipline, to set a path and a program for your relationship dynamic, you know what it is that you provide, you know what it is that you're offering. The tests that you set are things that lead towards the growth, the challenge, the stretching that leads towards an improvement of the dynamic to be in a place where integration is going to be more realistic and more sustainable. Then you're in a position to be dominant. You're in a position to take the masculine dominant leadership position. If the path of growth that you set for that relationship dynamic includes the self-actualization of your partner, then you're in a position to be a masculine dominant. But if whatever it is that you desire to meet your ego needs, what it is that you want up front, is something that you don't have the ability to be competent in that area, then it's going to conflate and create an issue if you try to prematurely integrate into making that something long-term and sustainable. Because once their desire burns out after the novelty and the newness of the situation, then their desire to do what it is that you want to do is going to go down. But they're going to desire for you to continue to invest the things that you were investing on the basis of what was being reciprocated. Like I said, anything that you trade for sex can be used against you. So if you take away the emotional validation because she's not being sexually available to you, you're seen as emotionally manipulative. If you take away the social validation because she's not being sexual with you, then that's seen as giving her ultimatums or pressuring her. Right? It's like you can't really have a truly equal conversation, right, about sex when it comes to trying to negotiate your needs in a relationship about what you really want, because that can come off as coercion. It can come off as manipulation. It can come off as if you are giving a person an ultimatum. It's just like, let's say you're in a marriage or you're in a relationship. The individual has only had sex with you maybe twice in the last 3 months. You say, listen, we need to be having more sex or I'm leaving. Now you can say that, but that woman can then go to the therapist and say, I feel pressured. She can go to the lawyer or whatever it is and say, I felt pressured, and because I felt pressure, I didn't desire to do it. See, that's psychological reactance. See, the submissive ego is going to find that directness. The submissive ego is going to find that dominance as something that's attractive, as something that's appealing. Right? So you have to understand the difference between a woman who wants plausible deniability and a woman who wants you to cater to her ego in order to meet your needs instead of having an intrinsic desire to do the things that you desire to do. You have to understand that in those scenarios, psychological reactance pops up. If she doesn't respect you enough, if you say something that contradicts where her mind is in that moment, then she is going to feel as if you are putting pressure on her. Because how I define pressure is like this. Anytime you are receiving something from an individual, you have to be receiving it already, unless you're an extremely insecure individual. Anytime you're receiving something from someone and they desire you to reciprocate something else, but what it is that they desire you to reciprocate is something that you don't have or that you don't desire to give, then you feel pressure. That doesn't take away the fact that it may be a transactional scenario, and that's just how it works, right? That's like if a prostitute goes to a man and says that, okay, cool, well, yeah, you paid me this money, but since you keep messaging me trying to see when I'm going to be available, I'm going to keep your money, and you can't go to the police because sex work is illegal, but I feel pressured, so now I feel uncomfortable, so I'm going to keep your money, and I'm just not going to fuck with you. You see stuff happening like that on Twitter and shit like that all the time. You see it happen all the time. That's why I say that, anything that you trade for sex can be used against you. It can be leveraged against you. That's why I say that as a dominant man, Sex is something that you provide. It's not something that you desire a woman to offer you. As a submissive man, if you're a feminine submissive man, then what that woman is really offering you is her time, her attention, right? The opportunity to be in her presence, the opportunity to deal with her at all. And then sex is a cherry on top that she gives if she's willing. And if she knows how to properly integrate with you and you're a feminine submissive man, then she will take pride out of being in that dominant position. She will take pride out of meeting your needs as you've met hers. She will take pride in coaching and training you to be in a position where the way that you conduct yourself with her makes her feel open and to desire to reciprocate you in the things that you desire sexually. But there's a high enough level of intrinsic desire involved within that relationship dynamic so that you are in a position where you don't feel like as if you are missing out on something because your needs aren't immediately met on a sexual level. Primarily as a feminine submissive man, it's your emotional desire for that woman and your just desire to be in her presence that extends above everything else. So even if sex isn't involved, it doesn't hurt your ego so much. You like the feeling of having to put in work. You like the feeling of having to change what you're doing in order to meet her needs. You like that feeling of having to get on her program. And if her program is good, then it may also lead to a growth of your financial life. It may also lead to a growth of your emotional intelligence. It may also lead to different things. But this is why I say relationships are not equal, right? Choosing to be submissive is consenting to be manipulated. It's Coach Brody. I'm out.